Welcome back to Vuln Vibes, everybody.
It's time for another WP Safe Block.
We're going to unpack
some WordPress vulnerabilities.
the latest vulnerabilities, really.
Try to make sense of all of them, right?
Exactly. And today we're diving into some pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, we're not going to bore you with Intro to WordPress Security 101 or any of that.
Right, we're assuming you're already familiar with, MITRE, ATT, and CK framework and all that.
Yeah, you guys already know all about kill chains and 0 days.
So we're going to cut to the chase. We're diving headfirst into a whole bunch of SQL injections.
Oh, yeah.
Cross-site scripting. And
all sorts of other crazy vulnerabilities.
Yeah, enough to give you nightmares.
It really is like a greatest hits compilation, but for web app vulnerabilities.
WordPress vulnerabilities specifically.
Yes, exactly. All neatly bundled up in some popular plugins.
Speaking of those greatest hits, one that really caught my eye was in the allimages.ai plugin. Have you seen this one?
Oh, yeah, that's the one with the file type validation, right?
Missing file type validation, yeah.
It's actually surprisingly common.
Yeah, and it can have some pretty nasty consequences.
It can.
Because, think about it. If you're not validating file types, it's basically like leaving your front door wide open.
Yeah, it's like a welcome mat for malicious files.
Exactly. And those malicious files, they're not coming empty-handed, right?
No, they're bringing the whole party. Backdoors, remote code execution, you name it.
Yep. So one little oversight can basically hand over the keys to your website to an attacker.
Which is not ideal.
Not ideal at all. And this really underscores how important it is to keep your plugins updated.
Oh, absolutely. Developers are constantly patching vulnerabilities. So if you're running an outdated version, you're making yourself an easy target.
Okay, let's move on to another vulnerability that caught my eye. This was in the customer email verification for WooCommerce plugin. Interesting little flaw they had there.
Ah, yeah, the authentication bypass, right?
That's the one. Attackers could basically just skip the whole login process and get straight into user accounts.
Like to have a skeleton key?
Exactly. Unlocks every door on your website.
And depending on, the website and the user roles, it's not just basic profiles they can access. We could be talking sensitive customer data, payment information.
Yeah, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, pretty much.
Not good.
It's a big deal. Definitely emphasizes why strong authentication is so important.
Absolutely. Multi-factor authentication, strong password policies, all that good stuff.
Anything that puts a roadblock between those attackers and your users.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about a plugin with a rather ironic name, Security and Malware Scan by Clean Talk.
Yeah, you can't make this stuff up.
A security plugin with a security flaw.
The irony is thick.
It's almost too perfect.
It seems like they were a little too trusting when it came to zip archives.
What do you mean?
Well, they were uploading and extracting those archives without the proper security checks in place.
So they were, just letting any malicious code hiding in those archives waltz right in?
Pretty much, like leaving the back door wide open.
Yikes. Instead of scanning for malware, they were practically inviting it in.
It's a tough lesson, Even security tools can have security issues.
Right.
It all comes back to staying vigilant, staying updated, never assume that anything is completely secure.
Speaking of staying vigilant, there was another vulnerability in a plugin called Export All Posts, Products, Orders, Refunds, and Users. Quite a mouthful.
That one definitely rings some alarm bells.
Yeah, it screams data leech.
It does, and it highlights why data storage and access control are so important. Seems like this plugin was storing sensitive user data in a publicly accessible directory.
Wait, so anyone could just access this information?
Basically, yeah, like leaving your company's most confidential files in a public Dropbox folder.
Oh man, that's a recipe for disaster.
It's a classic example of how important it is to secure your server environment. You can't assume that just because you trust your users, your server's as secure as Fort Knox.
Right. This really emphasizes the need for layered security.
Absolutely. Defense in depth. You need to protect your data at every level. Encrypt sensitive data, implement strong access controls, monitor your systems for any suspicious activity.
Okay, let's circle back to one of our favorite topics, cross-site scripting. Good old XSS. We saw this one pop up in the Wellcart e-commerce plugin.
XSS is like that telemarketer that just won't give up.
It's relentless.
It keeps popping up in different plugins, different forms, but it's always after the same thing, injecting those malicious scripts into websites.
And the consequences are serious, right?
Oh, yeah. Hijacked accounts, stolen data, website defacement, the list goes on.
And what makes XSS so tricky is its ability to, blend in.
It's a master of disguise, hiding in plain sight within legitimate-looking code. Just waiting for the right moment to strike.
Okay, before we wrap up this section, let's touch on another vulnerability that often flies under the radar. Cross-site request forgery, or CSRF.
Ah, CSRF, the digital puppet master.
Pulling the strings, making users do things they never intended to.
Exactly, and it's tough to detect because those requests are coming from the user's own browser. They look legitimate.
It's like a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Exactly, and we saw this in the WP Abstracts plugin, which just goes to show that any plugin can be vulnerable.
So it's not just about guarding against the big, obvious threats. We need to be aware of these more subtle attack vectors as well.
Absolutely. CSRF is a perfect example of how attackers are getting creative. They're always looking for new ways to exploit weaknesses.
So what can believers do to protect against CSRF?
Well, one really effective technique is to use anti-CSRF tokens.
What are those?
They're unique, unpredictable tokens that make it much harder for attackers to forge valid requests.
So it's like a secret handshake.
Exactly. The token acts as verification. It confirms that the request is coming from a legitimate source, not some attacker trying to hijack the session.
That's a pretty clever solution.
It is.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground today, but there's still more to discuss.
We're back, going through all these vulnerability reports. It's like, feels like reading one of those choose-your-own-adventure stories sometimes.
Except every choice could lead to a security nightmare.
Exactly. And today, our adventure is taking us into the wild world of SQL injection.
SQL injection, a classic.
A classic. And we've got a couple of plugins that decided to really embrace this vulnerability.
Oh, yeah? Which ones?
So we've got the LTL Freight Quotes Unishippers Edition.
Okay.
And then the Small Package Quotes Purelator Edition plugins.
All right. And what's going on with these?
Well, it seems like they kind of skipped over that whole secure coding chapter in their development journey.
They missed a pretty important one.
They did. It's almost as if they saw SQL injection as like a bonus feature.
Not a bug, but a feature.
Exactly.
So for the developers listening, let's talk about how to avoid these SQL injection pitfalls. What are some practical tips?
Okay, so rule number 1, treat all user input as if it's hostile. Don't trust it.
Be suspicious.
Always be suspicious. Never trust user input blindly.
So it's like setting up a Border Patrol checkpoint for any data coming in.
Exactly. You got to sanitize that input, scrub it clean, make sure it's following all the rules before you even let it near your database.
Okay, and what about parameterized queries? Those are like our security guards, right?
Absolutely. They act as a barrier between the user input and the database. Only valid data gets through.
All right, so let's switch gears for a moment and talk about a plugin that caught my attention because of its name. Security and Malware Scan by CleanTalk.
Oh, yeah, that one. The irony.
A security plugin with a security flaw?
It's almost poetic.
It's amazing. So what happened there?
Well, it seems this plugin was a bit too trusting when it came to zip archives.
What do you mean?
It was uploading and extracting them without any real security checks.
So any malicious files hiding in those archives could just slip right in?
Pretty much. They left the door wide open.
So instead of protecting against malware, it was basically welcoming it with open arms.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
That's rough. It really drives home the point that even the tools we use for security can be vulnerable.
Exactly. It all comes back to vigilance. Stay updated, keep a close eye on things, and never assume that anything is 100% secure.
Speaking of keeping a close eye on things, there's another vulnerability we need to talk about. This one was in a plugin called Export All Posts, Products, Orders, Refunds, and Users.
Okay, yeah, that one sounds a bit concerning.
Yeah, it kind of screams data leak to me.
It does, and it really emphasizes why data storage and access control are absolutely crucial. It seems like this plugin was storing sensitive user data in a publicly accessible directory.
Hold on. So anyone could just access this information?
Yeah, essentially, it's like leaving your company's confidential files in a Dropbox folder and setting it to public.
Oh, man. That's not good.
Not good at all. It's a classic example of why you can't just trust your users. You have to secure your server environment as well.
Right, so layered security is key.
Absolutely. Defense in depth. You need to protect your data at every level, encrypt it, restrict access, and constantly monitor your systems for suspicious activity.
Okay, let's go back to one of our favorite topics, cross-site scripting, or XSS. We saw this vulnerability pop up in the Wellcart e-commerce plugin.
XSS is like that annoying telemarketer who just keeps calling back no matter how many times you tell them to stop.
It's persistent.
It is. It pops up everywhere in all sorts of different plugins, but the goal is always the same. Inject those malicious scripts into websites.
And the consequences are serious, right?
Very serious. We're talking hijacked accounts, stolen data, website defacement, all kinds of nasty stuff.
And what makes XSS so difficult to deal with is its ability to hide in plain sight.
It's a master of camouflage. It blends in with legitimate code, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike.
Okay, before we move on, let's talk about another sneaky vulnerability. Cross-site request forgery, or CSRF.
Ah, CSRF, the puppet master.
Making users dance to their tune?
Exactly. And what makes CSRF so tricky is that the requests look like they're coming from the user themselves.
So they appear legitimate.
Completely legitimate. It's like a wolf in sheep's clothing.
We saw this in the WP Abstracts plugin, which shows us that any plugin can be vulnerable.
Absolutely. It's not just about protecting against the obvious threats. You have to watch out for these more subtle attacks as well.
So how can developers protect against CSRS?
One very effective technique is to implement anti-CSRF tokens.
Anti-CSRF tokens.
Yeah, they're basically unique, unpredictable tokens that make it much harder for attackers to forge valid requests.
So it's like a secret handshake.
Exactly. The token is like a verification code. It proves that the request is actually coming from the user and not from some attacker trying to hijack their session.
Okay, so we've covered quite a bit today. We've talked about SQL injection, we've discussed cross-site scripting, and we've explored the dangers of cross-site request forgery. But there's still more to come. Okay, so we've explored the dark depths of SQL injection, battled the stealthy ninjas of cross-site scripting, and exposed the puppet master behind cross-site request forgery.
It's been a wild ride, but now it's time to step back and analyze the battlefield, try to anticipate the enemy's next move.
Because in the world of WordPress security, let's face it, it's not a matter of if, but when that next vulnerability is going to pop up.
Exactly. So what have we learned from this latest wave of vulnerabilities? What are the trends? What patterns are we seeing? And how can security pros prepare for what's coming next?
Well, one thing that's impossible to ignore is just the sheer volume and variety of vulnerabilities.
It's like a hydra, right? You cut off one head, two more grow back.
And these vulnerabilities, they're not just limited to, like, obscure plugins that only a few websites use.
Nope, we're talking about popular plugins, millions of downloads, huge attack surface.
Yeah, the potential damage is enormous. So what's the solution? How do we keep up with this never-ending stream of vulnerabilities?
Well, it all starts with awareness. Security pros got to stay informed, know what threats are out there.
Read those security blogs.
Absolutely. Follow security researchers on social media. Subscribe to those vulnerability databases.
Knowledge is power, especially in cybersecurity.
Couldn't agree more. But it's not enough to just know about the threats. We got to be proactive.
So what does that look like? Proactive security.
For developers, secure coding practices right from the start.
Bake it into the process.
Exactly. Don't tack it on as an afterthought. Security has to be part of the DNA of every plugin.
And for website owners, it's all about that layered approach to security.
Multiple lines of defense. Keep those plugins updated. Choose them carefully in the first place.
Strong passwords.
Of course. Multi-factor authentication, and don't forget about monitoring. Got to keep an eye on your website for anything suspicious.
Make it as difficult as possible for attackers to get in.
Exactly. It's a constant process. You know, the threat landscape, it's always changing, so we have to constantly be adapting and improving our security posture.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's a great point to wrap things up on. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive into the world of WordPress vulnerabilities.
Always a pleasure to be here. And remember, folks, stay vigilant, stay informed, stay secure.
And don't forget to check out the show notes for links to all the resources we mentioned today, plus some extra tips on how to navigate the WordPress security jungle. Until next time, TSB.